Jerusalem, 1003 BC. The war horns echo through a valley south of the city. David, the giant killer, the king who defeated Goliath, stands at the head of his army. And he's terrified, because marching toward him through the valley of Rephaim aren't ordinary soldiers. They're the last survivors of a race that was supposed to be extinct. The Rephaim, the ancient giants, and they've come to take back what was theirs. This wasn't David's first battle. It wasn't even his first war. But the Bible records something unusual here, something it doesn't mention in any other battle. David inquired of the Lord. Twice, two separate battles in this same valley. 2 times David, the warrior who killed a giant as a teenager, stopped and asked God what to do, not how to win, whether he could win. What was in that valley that made a king hesitate? Why is it called the Valley of Rephaim, the Valley of the Dead Giants, if the giants were already gone? And why do ancient Jewish texts say this was the place where the last of the Nephilim bloodline made their final stand? Here's what archaeology won't tell you: that valley still exists. You can visit it today. It's a suburb of Jerusalem now. Houses, roads, shopping centers built over ancient battlegrounds. But dig down, go beneath the concrete, and you'll find something the history books ignore: giant tombs, massive stone chambers, evidence of a war that was never supposed to happen. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Did you know David fought giants after Goliath? What do you think really happened in that valley? Take a breath and come with me to the place where giants made their last stand, and David had to face the truth that Goliath was just the beginning. This is the entire story of the Valley of Rephaim, where giants made their last stand against David. Let's begin. In the hills southwest of Jerusalem, there is a valley. Today, it's a neighborhood, homes, streets, apartment buildings sprawling across what was once agricultural land. But the name remains: the Valley of Rephaim, the Valley of the Giants. 3,000 years ago, according to biblical tradition, something happened in this valley that would echo through history. A young king, newly crowned, his capital barely secure, faced an army in that valley. Not just any army. The texts describe warriors who came from a lineage the ancient world feared, a bloodline that biblical tradition traces back before the flood, back to a time when the boundaries between heaven and earth were crossed. The Bible names this place 8 times. Each mention is brief, almost casual, the way you might reference a location everyone knows, everyone remembers. But behind that name lies a story that threads through centuries of ancient Near Eastern tradition, connecting Genesis to Samuel, connecting myths whispered in Mesopotamian temples to battles fought in Judean hills. This is not about what is true. This is about what they believed was true, what the ancient Israelites preserved in their texts, what the Canaanites feared, what David's soldiers remembered, and why a valley, just a geographical depression between hills, carried a name that meant the place of the giants long after any giants, if they ever existed, were gone. The question scholars have wrestled with is this: who were the Rephaim? Where does this name come from? And why does the biblical narrative link them to a very specific valley at a very specific moment in Israel's history? To answer that, we need to go back. Not just to David's time, the 10th century BCE, when Jerusalem was still a small hill fort and Israel was a fragile kingdom, but further, back through the conquest narratives of Joshua, back through the wandering generation in Deuteronomy, back to the spies in Numbers who returned from Canaan with terrifying reports. And if we follow the thread far enough, we arrive at Genesis 6, a passage that has puzzled readers for 3 millennia, a passage about beings called Nephilim, about sons of God and daughters of humans, about a world before the flood where something happened that required divine intervention on a scale that would drown the world. The Valley of Rephaim is where this ancient story, this thread of biblical tradition about giants, divine judgment and forbidden mixing, reaches what the texts describe as its final chapter, the last stand, the end of a lineage that the biblical authors believed should never have existed. Whether you read these accounts as history, mythology, cultural memory, or theological narrative, they shaped how an entire civilization understood their world, their enemies, their fears, their divine mission. And at the center of it all is a valley, a king, and a question that has never been fully answered. What really happened there? Let's begin where the biblical text begins, not with David, not with the valley, but with the first mention of the beings whose name would come to define that place. Genesis chapter 6, 4 verses, and 2,000 years of debate. Genesis chapter 6 opens the biblical narrative of the flood. But before describing the waters that would cover the earth, before introducing Noah, the text presents a puzzling scene. In verses 1 through 4, the narrative describes a time when, in the words of the text, human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them. Then comes the passage that has launched countless interpretations. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Who were these sons of God? The Hebrew term is Beni Elohim, a phrase that appears in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38:7, where it clearly refers to divine beings who present themselves before God. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the divine council, the assembly of divine beings who serve the high God, was a common concept. Ugaritic texts from Canaan describe similar assemblies. The Mesopotamian pantheon operated on comparable principles. The early Jewish interpretations, preserved in texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, understood Beni Elohim as angelic beings. These texts, some dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, describe these beings as watchers, angels tasked with observing humanity who, according to the narrative, violated their purpose and descended to earth. Later rabbinic tradition, particularly after the 1st century CE, offered alternative interpretations. Some rabbis argued the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of Adam, who intermarried with the descendants of Cain. This interpretation emphasized human free will and responsibility rather than supernatural corruption. Christian interpretation has historically been divided. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian accepted the angelic interpretation. Later theologians, including Augustine, favored the Sethite view. The debate continues in Christian scholarship today. The text continues with a statement that has generated its own complexity. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. What does this mean? Is it a countdown to the flood, 120 years of warning, a reduction in human lifespan from the centuries-long lives described in Genesis 5, a statement about divine patience reaching its limit? The Hebrew is ambiguous enough to support multiple readings. Then comes verse 4, the verse that introduces the beings whose legacy will echo through the rest of biblical tradition. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Nephilim. The Hebrew word Nephilim is grammatically related to the verb naphal, meaning to fall. Some scholars translate it as the fallen ones. Others argue it means those who cause others to fall. Still others suggest it refers to giants, based on how the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, renders the term as gigantes. The text describes them as Gibborim, often translated as mighty men or warriors, a term that appears throughout the Old Testament for powerful fighters. They were men of renown, literally in Hebrew, men of the name, suggesting fame, reputation, a legacy that outlasted their lives. But here's what makes verse 4 so complicated. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Afterward, after what? The flood hasn't been mentioned yet in the narrative, but it's coming in the next verses. The text seems to acknowledge that these beings existed both before the flood and survived it somehow, or appeared again later. This phrase, these two words in Hebrew, creates a narrative problem that biblical interpreters have struggled with for centuries. Because if the flood was meant to wipe out the corruption these beings represented, and Genesis 6:5-7 describes God's response in exactly those terms, with the text stating, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth." How do they show up again? We'll return to that question. For now, let's examine what happened next in the biblical account. Genesis 6:5-8 describes the divine response to this situation. The text states, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." This is significant theological language in the biblical narrative. The description isn't just about bad actions, but about the corruption of human nature at its source. The heart, the inclinations, the thoughts. The Hebrew word ra, wickedness, evil, is repeated, emphasizing total moral collapse. Verse 6 then states, "The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." This verse has rated enormous theological discussion. The Hebrew word nacham is translated as regretted or grieved or was sorry. Different theological traditions handle this anthropomorphic language differently. Some see it as literal divine emotion, God genuinely experiencing regret. Others interpret it as phenomenological language, describing from a human perspective what divine response looks like, without implying God didn't foresee this outcome or made a mistake in creation. Islamic tradition, for instance, maintains that God is all-knowing and doesn't experience regret as humans do, making this verse a key point where biblical and Quranic theology diverge. Jewish and Christian interpreters have debated for centuries what this language means about divine nature. The biblical text continues, "So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." But then verse 8, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." The flood narrative follows: the ark, the animals, the waters covering the earth, the destruction of all land-dwelling life except what was preserved in the ark. According to the biblical chronology, this would place the flood somewhere around 2300 to 500 BCE in traditional calculations, though scholars debate these dates extensively. The flood, in biblical theology, serves as a reset, a divine judgment that wipes the slate clean, removing the corruption that had infected creation. The text describes it as comprehensive. Everything with the breath of life in its nostrils died. So the Nephilim should have died in the flood. The genetic corruption they represented, whatever it was, should have ended. The sons of God should have been restrained. The problem should have been solved, except for those two words back in Genesis 6:4, and also afterward. Fast forward now in the biblical narrative, approximately 800 years according to traditional chronology. The Israelites have left Egypt. They've received the law at Sinai. They've wandered the desert for decades because of their initial refusal to enter the promised land. Now, finally, they stand at the border of Canaan, preparing to attempt conquest once more. Moses sends 12 spies into the land to scout it. Numbers 13 describes their mission and their report. The spies spend 40 days in Canaan. They see the cities, the people, the land itself. They bring back a cluster of grapes so large it takes 2 men to carry it on a pole, the text emphasizing the fertility and abundance of the land. But then comes their report about the inhabitants. Numbers 13, 28-33 records what they told Moses and the assembly. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Anakim. This is the first mention in the biblical narrative of a specific people group associated with exceptional size. The text continues. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb, one of the spies, tries to encourage the people. We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the other spies, 10 of them, disagree. Verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." Then comes verse 32-33, one of the most debated passages in the conquest narrative. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." There's the word again. Nephilim, the same term from Genesis 6:4, but this is centuries after the flood. How can Nephilim be in Canaan? The text offers a parenthetical explanation. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This connects the Anakim, the people of great size currently living in Canaan, to the pre-flood beings described in Genesis. But this raises more questions than it answers. Did some Nephilim survive the flood? Did the sons of God produce more offspring after the flood, creating a new generation? Did the genetic corruption somehow pass through the flood via someone on the ark? The biblical text doesn't explain. It simply presents the connection as fact, as something the ancient Israelites believe. The Anakim, the giants in Canaan, were descendants of the Nephilim. The bloodline continued. This report causes a crisis. The Israelites refuse to enter the land. They weep all night. They complain against Moses and Aaron. Numbers 14:1-4 describes them saying, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land? Only to let us fall by the sword. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" The divine response, according to the text, is severe. That generation, everyone 20 years old and older except Caleb and Joshua, will die in the wilderness. They'll wander for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies explored the land, until that entire generation has perished. The giants in the land become the reason for 40 more years of desert wandering. The reason an entire generation never sees the promised land. But who were these giants? What made them so terrifying that trained men who had seen Egypt's armies destroyed, who had witnessed divine miracles, refused to fight them? The biblical text gives us names, not just Anakim, but multiple people groups associated with exceptional size and strength. Deuteronomy 2-3, spoken by Moses near the end of the 40 years, provide crucial context. These chapters describe the journey around the eastern side of the Dead Sea and the territories the Israelites encountered. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 states, "The Amites used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaites, but the Moabites called them Amites." There's our word, REPHAIM. The biblical text uses it as a category, a classification for multiple groups of people known for their size and strength. The Amites were considered REPHAIM. So were the Anakites. The passage continues in verses 12-13 with historical information about previous inhabitants. Horites used to live in Seir, but the descendants of Esau drove them out. They destroyed the Horites from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did in the land the Lord gave them as their possession. Then, moving north in the narrative, Deuteronomy 2:20-21, That too was considered a land of the Rephaites who used to live there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzamites. They were a people strong and numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. The Lord destroyed them from before the Ammonites, who drove them out and settled in their place. The pattern is clear. Multiple people groups, different names depending on who's doing the naming, but all described with similar terms: strong, numerous, tall. All categorized under the Hebrew term REPHAIM. Deuteronomy 3:11 provides specific detail about one individual. Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaites. His bed was decorated with iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. A cubit is approximately 18 inches. 9 cubits would be over 13 feet long. Now the text is describing a bed, not the man himself, so we can't directly calculate his height. But even if the bed was oversized, a status symbol, the implication is clear. Og was extraordinarily large, and the text emphasizes he was the last of the Rephaites in that region, suggesting the others had been defeated or driven out. The biblical narrative in Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy 3 describes Israel's victory over Og and his kingdom. According to these texts, this happened during the wilderness period, before entering Canaan proper. The defeat of Og, the last of the Rephaim in the Transjordan, is presented as a significant military and theological victory. But Og wasn't the last Rephait overall. Because the text makes clear, there were Anakim in Canaan itself, and the Anakim, the text states explicitly, came from the Nephilim. Joshua 11:21-22 describes what happened during the conquest under Joshua. At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. This passage is critical. Joshua's campaign targeted the Anakim specifically. The text describes systematic elimination from the hill country of Judah and Israel. But notice the exception. Some survived in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These are Philistine cities, the coastal plain, territory that remained outside Israelite control during Joshua's lifetime. Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. Remember these names, because centuries later, when David faces giants, when the biblical narrative describes the final confrontations with these beings, Gath keeps appearing. Every giant David or his men fight is from Gath. The Anakim who survived Joshua's campaign, who lived in the Philistine cities, who maintained their lineage in territory Israel didn't control. This is where the Valley of Rephaim enters the story. But before we get to David and the valley, we need to understand what the biblical and extra-biblical sources actually claim about these beings. What made them different? What threatened them? Why did the biblical authors present their elimination as necessary? The book O.F. Enoch, preserved in its entirety only by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, provides the most detailed account. Scholars date the earliest sections of Enoch to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, making it considerably later than the events it describes, but still ancient by any measure. Enoch chapters 6 through 16 describe what the text calls the Book of the Watchers. According to this narrative, 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon, a real geographical location in the northern part of modern Israel, Syria. They swore an oath together, binding themselves to their plan. The text names their leaders: Semjaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakiel, Kokabeel, and others. It describes them taking human wives and, according to the narrative, teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. Enoch 7:1-6 describes the consequences. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. The text portrays a world spiraling into chaos, not just moral corruption but ecological and cosmic disruption. Violence, bloodshed, the strong literally consuming the weak. Enoch 8 describes the forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kakibal taught the constellations. And Amazarach taught all the sorcerers and dividers and root cutters. Weapons, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, sorcery, magic. According to this tradition, these weren't human discoveries. They were divine secrets revealed before their proper time, knowledge humanity wasn't ready to handle responsibly. Whether we read this as history or mythology, it reflects ancient anxieties about technology, knowledge, and the pace of human advancement. The tradition suggests that humanity's technological leap, from stone to metal, from simple tools to weapons of war, came too fast, too soon from the wrong source. The Book of Jubilees, another Jewish text from the 2nd century BCE, offers a similar but slightly different account. Jubilees 5:1-11 describes the Watchers, their descent, their offspring, and the resulting violence. But it also emphasizes demonic activity, the tradition that when the giants died, their spirits became demons that continued to plague humanity. These texts weren't scripture for most Jewish and Christian communities. The Book of Enoch is canonical only for the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches. Jubilees was influential but not included in most biblical canons, yet they represent how ancient Jewish communities understood Genesis 6:1-4. The interpretive tradition that filled in the gaps, explained the mysteries, provided narrative coherence to the puzzling verses. And here's what's crucial. These interpretive traditions shaped how ancient Israelites understood their enemies. When they looked at the Anakim in Canaan, when they heard about the Rephaim, when they encountered people of exceptional size and strength, they saw the remnants of this pre-flood corruption. Not just human enemies, but something connected to that primal boundary crossing, that mixing of divine and human that required the flood to reset. This is why the conquest narratives in Joshua emphasize the destruction of these people specifically. This is why Deuteronomy 20:16-18 commands complete destruction of certain Canaanite groups, not out of ethnic hatred but theological concern. The biblical authors presented this as preventing the spread of corruption, eliminating bloodlines that shouldn't exist. Whether this theological framework justified actual historical violence, whether these commands were carried out literally or were later literary constructions, scholars debate intensely. Archaeological evidence suggests the Israelite emergence in Canaan was more gradual, more complex than Joshua's narrative implies. But what's undeniable is that this is how the biblical authors framed it: a holy war against a corrupted lineage. Now let's examine what archaeology and ancient texts outside the Bible reveal about these people. The Rephaim appear not just in the Bible but in Ugaritic texts from the ancient Canaanite city of Ugarit, modern-day Ras Shamra in Syria. These texts, dated to the 14th-13th centuries BCE, mention the REPHAIM, the same consonantal root as Hebrew Rephaim. In Ugaritic literature, the REPHAIM appear to be deceased kings or ancestral spirits, powerful figures from the past who possess special status. Some tablets describe them gathering for feasts, having strength and authority even in death. This creates an interesting puzzle. Are the biblical Rephaim and the Ugaritic REPHAIM the same, or are we seeing two different uses of the same term? Hebrew Rephaim has a similar double meaning. In Isaiah 14:9, 26:14, and other passages, the term refers to departed spirits, the dead, the shades in Sheol. But in Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Samuel, it clearly refers to living people, the giants, the strong warriors, the people groups of exceptional size. Some scholars suggest the term originally meant the mighty dead and was applied to living people as a comparison. They're like the legendary figures of the past. Others argue it started as an ethnic designation and was later used metaphorically for the dead. The linguistic etymology remains debated. What about physical evidence? Have archaeologists found evidence of unusually tall people in ancient Canaan? The answer is complicated. Human remains from late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Canaan show typical human size variation. There's no evidence of a population averaging 7 or 8 feet tall. The anthropological data doesn't support literal giants. However, two factors add nuance. First, ancient populations were generally shorter than modern populations due to nutrition, disease, and other factors. An exceptionally tall individual in that context, someone 6'6" or taller, would have seemed giant-like. The comparative effect would be pronounced. Second, elite warrior classes in the ancient Near East sometimes came from specific families or lineages known for producing large, strong individuals. Just as certain populations today have greater average height, genetic factors could produce families where exceptional size was more common. The biblical descriptions might be hyperbolic, taking real differences in average height and exaggerating them in the retelling. Or they might preserve cultural memory of populations that genuinely had notably larger individuals. Perhaps due to genetic factors we don't fully understand. Goliath, described in 1 Samuel 17:4 as 6 cubits and a span, over 9 feet in most English translations, presents this problem. That height is medically possible but extremely rare, gigantism caused by pituitary disorders. However, some ancient Greek manuscripts of 1 Samuel give Goliath's height as 4 cubits and a span, closer to 6'9", which is tall but not impossible. Text criticism, determining the original reading, remains unsettled. The point is this: whether the REPHAIM were literally giants in the fantastical sense or simply a people group notable for producing unusually large warriors, the ancient Israelites perceived them as different, threatening, and connected to that Genesis 6 narrative about boundaries being crossed. Now we can finally turn to the Valley of Rephaim. Why did this particular valley, this geographical feature southwest of Jerusalem, carry this name? What happened there that linked it forever to these ancient beings? The valley is mentioned 8 times in the Hebrew Bible. Its location is consistently described as southwest or west of Jerusalem, in the borderland between Judah and the Philistine territory. Joshua 15:8 defines it as part of the northern boundary of Judah. Then it ran up the valley of Ben Hinnom along the southern slope of the Jebusite city, that is, Jerusalem. From there, it climbed to the top of the hill west of the Hinnom Valley at the northern end of the Valley of Rephaim. Joshua 18:16 describes it from the Benjamin perspective. The boundary went down to the foot of the hill facing the Valley of Ben Hinnom, north of the Valley of Rephaim. So the valley's location is clear. Southwest of Jerusalem, near but not identical to the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna in later Jewish tradition. It was a significant geographical feature on the tribal boundary. But why was it called the Valley of Rephaim? The text doesn't explain. The name is simply used as if everyone knows what it means, why it's called that. 2 possibilities exist. First, that Rephaim once lived there, that this was territory associated with these people before Israel arrived, and the name preserved that memory. Second, that events involving Rephaim happened there, making it a memorial site. The biblical narrative describes both as true. 2 Samuel 5:17-25 and 2 Samuel 23:13-17 record battles in the valley. But let's not jump ahead. We need to understand who's fighting and why. David's story is well known. The shepherd boy who killed Goliath, served King Saul, fled persecution, became king first over Judah and then all Israel. But the period immediately after his coronation over all Israel, described in 2 Samuel 5, is when the valley of Rephaim becomes significant. 2 Samuel 5, 6-10 describes David capturing Jerusalem. The text says the Jebusites taunted him, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." David's forces captured the city anyway, and he made it his capital, the city of David. Then verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him. Why did the Philistines respond to David's coronation by launching a military campaign? Because David, despite being Israelite, had spent years living among the Philistines during his flight from Saul. 1 Samuel 27 describes him serving King Achish of Gath. The Philistines probably saw David's consolidation of power as a threat. Their former client was now an independent king with a unified nation. The text continues, "But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold." Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. The Philistines chose the valley of Rephaim as their staging ground. This makes strategic sense. It's close to Jerusalem, but outside the hill country, suitable for their military tactics, positioned between their coastal territory and David's capital. But was the choice purely strategic, or did the name of the valley, its associations, carry meaning? We can't know for certain. But consider, the Philistines controlled Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, the very cities where Joshua 11:22 says Anakim survived. Goliath, whom David killed years earlier, was from Gath. The biblical text consistently describes Philistine warriors of exceptional size coming from Gath. The Philistines assembling in the valley of Rephaim, the valley of the giants, might have been coincidental geography, or it might have been psychological warfare. A statement, "Remember what your spies saw, remember what your people feared. We have that bloodline, we control that legacy." This valley bears their name, and whether intentional or not, the biblical narrative creates that connection. The last battles involving beings linked to the Nephilim Anakim Rephaim lineage happen in a valley named for them. 2 Samuel 5:19 describes David's response. "So David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go and attack the Philistine? Will you deliver them into my hands?' The Lord answered him, 'Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands.'" David attacks. Verse 20, "So David went to Baal-perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, 'As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me.' So that place was called Baal-perazim. Baal-perazim, Lord of breaking through. The text describes a decisive victory, the Philistines fleeing, leaving their idols behind, which David's men carried off. But the Philistines regroup. Verse 22, "Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim." A second battle in the same location. This time David receives different tactical instructions. Verses 23-24, "So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, 'Do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees. As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army.'" The description is vivid, a sound in the trees signaling divine action, a flanking maneuver, a rout. Verse 25, "So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibon to Jezer." These victories secured David's kingdom. The Philistines, who had dominated Israel during Saul's reign, were pushed back. Jerusalem was safe. The new capital was established. But 2 Samuel 21 and 23 describe additional encounters with Philistine warriors, specifically warriors of exceptional size, warriors connected to Gath. warriors whose descriptions echo the old REPHAIM tradition. 2 Samuel 21:15-22 provides 4 accounts of battles with giants. The passage begins, "Once again there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted." Verse 16 introduces the first giant. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. The Hebrew phrase is Be'eliti Harapha, literally, in the children descendants of Rapha, or among those born to Rapha. Rapha appears to be either a person or a collective term for the REPHAIM lineage. The text is linking this warrior directly to that ancient bloodline. David is saved by Abishai son of Zeruiah, who kills Ishbi-Benob. After this, David's men make him promise not to accompany them to battle anymore, saying, "You must not quench the lamp of Israel." But the battles with giants continue. Verse 18-19. In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan son of Jair the Bethlehemite killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Wait, the brother of Goliath. This raises textual questions, because 1 Samuel 17 describes David killing Goliath. Some manuscripts and the parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 20:5 say Elhanan killed Lami, the brother of Goliath. The textual variants are complex, possibly involving scribal errors or conflation of traditions, but the consistent element is Goliath's family from Gath, still producing warriors of exceptional size. Then comes perhaps the most striking description. Verse 20-21, in still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. 6 fingers, 6 toes, polydactyly, extra digits, is a real but rare genetic condition. Finding it in a warrior described as descended from Rapha, fighting in Gath, adds an eerie detail to the biblical account. It suggests to ancient readers a genetic abnormality, something marking these individuals as different. The passage concludes in verse 22. These 4 were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. 4 battles, 4 giants, all connected to Gath, all described as descendants of Rapha, all defeated by David or his warriors. The valley of Rephaim was where David fought Philistine armies. These later encounters with individual giant warriors extended over years, but the biblical narrative presents them as connected. The final elimination of the Rephaim lineage, the completion of what Joshua started, the end of the genetic corruption that traced back to Genesis 6. 2 Samuel 23 provides more context. This chapter lists David's mighty men, his elite warriors. Verses 13-17 describe an incident during one of the Philistine occupations of the valley of Rephaim. During harvest time, 3 of the 30 chief warriors came down to David at the cave of Adullam, while a band of Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. At that time, David was in the stronghold, and the Philistine garrison was at Bethlehem. David, nostalgically, expresses a wish. "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." 3 of his warriors hear this. Without David ordering them, without asking for permission, they break through the Philistine lines, draw water from the well in Bethlehem, and bring it back to David. David refuses to drink it. Verse 16-17, but he refused to drink it. Instead, he poured it out before the Lord. "Far be it from me, Lord, to do this," he said. "Is it not the blood of men who went at the risk of their lives?" The story illustrates the loyalty and courage of David's men. But notice the setting, the valley of Rephaim. The Philistines encamped there, a garrison in Bethlehem, David in his stronghold. The valley was contested territory, a place of repeated conflict between Israel and the Philistines. Why did the Philistines keep returning to this valley? Strategically, it was an ideal invasion route, a broad valley leading from the coastal plain toward Jerusalem. But given the biblical narrative's emphasis on the Rephaim lineage, on the giants from Gath, on the connections to that ancient bloodline, the repeated battles in this specific valley carry symbolic weight. The tradition that the biblical authors preserved presented David's victories there as more than military triumph. They were theological victory. The completion of the conquest Joshua began. The final elimination of beings who shouldn't have existed, whose bloodline traced back to the forbidden mixing of divine and human in Genesis 6. But let's pause here and consider different perspectives. We've been following the biblical narrative's own logic, its internal coherence. But how do different communities of faith understand this material? Jewish tradition has multiple views on the Nephilim and Rephaim. As mentioned earlier, some rabbis interpreted Genesis 6 as referring to human intermarriage, the line of Seth mixing with the line of Cain. This avoids supernatural elements and focuses on human moral failure. Other Jewish sources, particularly earlier ones like the Book of Enoch, maintain the angelic interpretation. Medieval Jewish commentators like Rashi offered various explanations, some natural, some supernatural. The Rephaim in later Jewish texts sometimes refer to departed spirits, the shades in Sheol. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, contain fragments discussing the Nephilim and Watchers, showing these traditions remained part of Jewish thought into the Second Temple period. Christian interpretation, as noted, has been divided from early on. Some church fathers accepted the angelic view based on texts like the Book of Enoch, which Jude quotes in the New Testament. Others, particularly after Augustine, favored the Sethite interpretation. Modern Christian scholars are split, with some evangelical interpreters returning to the angelic view based on linguistic and contextual analysis, while others maintain the Sethite or other naturalistic readings. The key theological concern for many Christian interpreters is maintaining proper boundaries between the divine and human realms. The incarnation of Christ, God becoming human, is seen as the proper, intended union of divine and human nature. The Genesis 6 account, if taken as illicit angelic human mixing, represents an improper boundary violation. Islamic tradition presents a different picture entirely. The Quran doesn't mention the Genesis 6 sons of God account. Angels in Islamic theology cannot rebel in the way the Book of Enoch describes. They have no free will to disobey God. The Quranic account of the flood focuses on Noah's preaching, the people's rejection, and the divine judgment, without reference to Nephilim or fallen angels. Islamic tradition knows of the jinn, beings created from smokeless fire who have free will and can choose good or evil. Some Islamic scholars have suggested that if something like the Genesis 6 account has any reality, it might involve jinn rather than angels. But this is speculative. The Quran doesn't address the topic directly. This difference is why academic distance is so important when discussing these traditions. What the Bible describes as angels intermarrying with humans, what Jewish texts like Enoch elaborate, what early Christians debated, these aren't universal truths but specific traditions within particular faith communities. Muslims, when encountering this material, understand it as what the Bible says, not necessarily as what happened. Secular scholarship approaches the material from yet another angle. Critical biblical scholars often see the Genesis 6, 1-4 passage as a fragment of older mythology, perhaps connected to ancient Near Eastern stories about divine beings mating with humans. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Gilgamesh himself as part divine. Greek mythology is filled with demigods. Many ancient cultures had traditions of heroes born from divine-human unions. Some scholars suggest Genesis 6:1-4 is a polemic against these mythologies, acknowledging their existence in cultural memory, but reframing them as violation and corruption rather than glorification. The flood becomes God's response to this boundary violation. The REPHAIM, in this scholarly view, might have been a real people group, perhaps an early Bronze Age population in Canaan, remembered for their military prowess or certain physical characteristics. The name became legendary, attached to ancient kings, as in the Ugaritic texts, used to describe impressive figures of the past, and eventually connected to the Genesis 6 narrative as part of an overarching theological story about divine judgment and human boundaries. The battles in the Valley of Rephaim would then be historical military encounters between David's forces and Philistine armies, later narrated within a theological framework that saw eliminating Philistine warriors from Gath as completing the divinely mandated conquest, ending the Rephaim lineage. This doesn't make the biblical narrative untrue in the sense of having no historical kernel. It simply recognizes that ancient texts weave together history, theology, cultural memory, and interpretive tradition in complex ways. So what do we have when we put all this together? We have a biblical narrative that begins in Genesis with a mysterious passage about sons of God and daughters of humans producing offspring called Nephilim. The text links this to the flood, divine judgment against corruption that had infected creation. We have the Israelites, centuries later according to the biblical timeline, encountering people groups in Canaan described as unusually large and strong, the Anakim. The text explicitly connects them to the Nephilim, treating them as descendants, as a continuation of that ancient bloodline. We have multiple people groups categorized as Rephaim, Amites, Zamzamites, Anakim, and others, living in various parts of Canaan and the Transjordan. Some are defeated before the conquest. Others survive in Philistine territory. We have Joshua's campaign specifically targeting the Anakim, systematically eliminating them from Israelite hill country, but acknowledging survivors in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, Philistine cities. We have David, first as a young man killing Goliath from Gath, then as king fighting repeated battles in the Valley of Rephaim against Philistine forces, and finally his warriors killing 4 more giants, all from Gath, all described as descendants of Rapha. The biblical narrative presents this as an arc, a single story stretching from Genesis to Samuel, from the pre-flood world to David's reign, from the original corruption to its final elimination. The Valley of Rephaim is where that arc concludes. Not in the garden, not at the flood, not at Sinai or Jericho, but in a valley southwest of Jerusalem where the last of the giant lineage make their stand and fall. Whether we read this as history, theology, cultural memory, or literary construe, it's coherent within its own framework. The biblical authors weren't randomly mentioning giants. They were telling a complete story about boundaries, corruption, judgment, and restoration. But mysteries remain, questions the text doesn't fully answer. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, how did they reappear? The text says, and also afterward, but never explains the mechanism. Did some survive? Did the sons of God create more after the flood? Did Ham, Noah's son, carry some genetic corruption? Various theories exist, none conclusive. Why were the Rephaim concentrated in particular regions, especially around Gath? Was it actual genetic lineage, or cultural identity, or simply that certain families in certain cities produced larger warriors and the reputation grew from there? What did the Valley of Rephaim look like in David's time? The modern neighborhood of Beit HaCherem covers much of it. Archaeological excavations have found remains from various periods, but nothing definitive connecting to the specific biblical battles or to giant inhabitants. Were there really people with 6 fingers and 6 toes, or is that literary exaggeration? Polydactyly exists, so it's medically possible. But whether the biblical account preserves accurate physical description or embellishes for effect, we can't determine. Did David see his battles in the valley of Rephaim as completing a sacred mission? Did he understand himself as finishing what Moses and Joshua began, the elimination of the Rephaim lineage? The text doesn't give us David's internal thoughts. We have the narrative framework the biblical authors created, but David's own understanding might have been simpler, more pragmatic. These are enemies threatening my kingdom, and they must be defeated. One final element deserves consideration. The name Rephaim appears in one more significant context in the Hebrew Bible, as a term for the dead, the shades, the departed spirits in Sheol. Isaiah 26:14 says, "They are now dead, they live no more, their spirits do not rise. You punished them and brought them to ruin. You wiped out all memory of them." The Hebrew word translated spirits is Rephaim. The passage speaks of departed enemies who will not rise again. Isaiah 14, in a taunt against the king of Babylon, uses similar language. Verse 9, "The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you." Again, spirits of the departed translates Rephaim. This dual usage, the Rephaim as both giant warriors and the shades of the dead, creates interesting theological resonance. Were the Rephaim as departed spirits the mighty warriors of old, now in Sheol? Is there a connection between these people who shouldn't have existed in life and their state in death? Job 26:5-6 says, "The dead are in deep anguish, those beneath the waters and all that live in them. The realm of the dead is naked before God, destruction lies uncovered." The Hebrew for the dead in verse 5 is again Rephaim. The passage connects them to the waters, perhaps echoing the flood that was supposed to destroy them. These connections are suggestive but not explicit. The biblical text uses Rephaim in multiple ways without clearly explaining the relationship between the uses. Are they the same Rephaim? Different groups using the same name? A term that evolved in meaning over time? We can speculate, but the text doesn't resolve the ambiguity. What we can say is this: the biblical narrative about the valley of Rephaim, about David's battles there, about the giants from Gath, this isn't isolated. It's the conclusion of a much longer story, a thread that runs from Genesis through the Torah, through Joshua and Judges, to Samuel and beyond. The ancient Israelites, or at least the biblical authors and redactors who shaped these texts, saw continuity. They connected the sons of God in Genesis 6 to the Nephilim to the Anakim to the Rephaim, and the last Rephaim to Gath and the valley named for them. They presented David's victories not just as political or military success, but as theological completion. The bloodline that traced back to forbidden mixing, that survived the flood somehow, that persisted through Joshua's conquest in Philistine territory. David and his men eliminated the last of them. After David, the biblical text doesn't mention giants anymore. No more Rephaim, no more warriors with 6 fingers, no more spears like weaver's rods. The arc is complete. The Valley of Rephaim remains as a name, a memory, a geographical feature. But the beings it was named for, according to this tradition, are gone. David was the last Israelite king to fight them. The Valley of Rephaim was their last stand. And whether we understand this as literal history, as cultural memory shaped by theological concerns, as mythology woven into national narrative, or as some combination of all these elements, it remains a powerful story. Out boundaries, about what should and shouldn't be, about divine justice, about the price of corruption, and about the end of an age. The texts describe a world before the flood that was fundamentally broken, where categories that should have remained separate were mixed, where beings that shouldn't have existed walked the earth. The flood was the reset, but the reset was incomplete, something persisted. And so the conquest became necessary. And when the conquest was incomplete, David finished it. This is what the tradition describes, what early communities believed happened, what shaped how they understood their history, their enemies, their divine mission. The Valley of Rephaim stands as the final chapter in that story, a valley southwest of Jerusalem where giants, whatever they truly were, made their last stand against a shepherd king who had killed their greatest champion and would become Israel's greatest ruler. The Valley of Rephaim. We've traced the biblical narrative from Genesis to Samuel, followed the thread of giants and divine judgment through centuries of tradition. But now let's go deeper. Let's examine what this valley actually was, what the ancient world surrounding it looked like, and what these stories might have meant to the people who told them. Because here's what we haven't fully addressed. Why giants? Why did so many ancient cultures, not just Israel, have traditions about beings of exceptional size and strength who once walked the earth? Why do these stories appear in Mesopotamian texts, Egyptian inscriptions, Greek mythology, and cultures across the world? The universal nature of giant traditions suggests something deeper than simple storytelling. Whether that something is historical memory of unusually large populations, exaggeration of real enemies, dim recollections of now extinct hominid species, or pure mythology meeting human psychological needs, scholars debate all these possibilities. Let's start with the archaeological reality of the land itself. The Valley of Rephaim, in geographical terms, is a broad valley running roughly north-south, southwest of Jerusalem's Old City. In ancient times, it would have been fertile agricultural land. The Hebrew word Rephaim in later Hebrew came to mean shades or ghosts, but some scholars have suggested a possible connection to a root meaning healers or even fertile ones. Today, the Emek Rephaim neighborhood occupies part of this valley. It's a bustling area of cafes, shops, and apartments. But underneath, buried under millennia of human habitation, beneath streets and buildings, lies the landscape David knew. Archaeological excavations in and around Jerusalem have revealed what the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age looked like in this region. This was the period of Israel's emergence as a people, roughly 1200–1000 BCE, culminating in David's reign around 1970 BCE, according to traditional chronology. What we find is a world in transition. The late Bronze Age had seen Egyptian dominance over Canaan, with city-states paying tribute to pharaohs. The Sea Peoples, including the Philistines, arrived around 1200 BCE, disrupting established powers and settling the coastal plain. The great civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, had collapsed in what scholars call the Bronze Age collapse, a cascading systemic failure that reshaped the Mediterranean world. Into this power vacuum, new groups emerged: the Philistines on the coast, the Israelites in the hill country, the Arameans in Syria, small kingdoms fighting for survival and dominance. The Valley of Rephaim sat at a strategic boundary. To the west and southwest lay Philistine territory, the 5 cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. To the east lay the Judean hill country, rough terrain that favored defenders and small-scale agriculture. Jerusalem itself, perched on a ridge between valleys, was a modest city, nothing like the grand metropolis it would become under Solomon and later kings. When the biblical text describes Philistine armies spreading out in the Valley of Rephaim, it's describing a logical invasion route. The valley provided access from the coastal plain toward Jerusalem without requiring the attacking force to fight through heavily fortified hill country. It was the path of least resistance. But it was also exposed. An army in the valley could be flanked, attacked from higher ground, cut off from supply lines. David's victories there, described in 2 Samuel 5, depended on using the terrain wisely, on receiving divine guidance about tactics, on striking at the right moment. The archaeological remains from this period show evidence of conflict. Destruction layers in various sites, weapons, fortifications. The transition from late Bronze Age to Iron Age I and II was not peaceful. Cities changed hands, populations shifted. New technologies, particularly iron metallurgy, which gives the Iron Age its name, changed warfare. And here's an interest. In detail, the Philistines had superior iron technology. The biblical text acknowledges that. 1 Samuel 13, 19-22 describes how not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The passage continues. On the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. This is significant. The Philistines controlled iron production and distribution. This gave them a military advantage, better weapons, better armor. When the biblical text describes Goliath's armor in 1 Samuel 17, bronze helmet, coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels, bronze javelin, it's emphasizing technological superiority. By David's time, this was changing. Israel was acquiring iron technology. David's victories over the Philistines corresponded with Israel's technological advancement. The Valley of Rephaim battles happened at a moment of transition, when the Philistine monopoly on advanced metallurgy was breaking down. Now, did this have anything to do with giants, with Rephaim, with ancient bloodlines? Not in any direct sense, but consider the narrative the biblical authors were constructing. They lived in a world where the Philistines had been the dominant military power. They knew the tradition that exceptional warriors from Gath, Goliath, and others had terrorized Israel. They preserved stories about these warriors being unusually large, unusually strong, equipped with superior weapons. The connection to the Rephaim tradition, the giants who once inhabited the land, made narrative sense. It explained Philistine military dominance not just technologically, but cosmologically. These weren't just skilled warriors with better weapons. They were, according to tradition, the last remnants of a corrupted bloodline that stretched back to before the flood. David defeating them wasn't just military victory, it was theological completion, the restoration of right order. Let's examine what ancient Near Eastern texts outside the Bible say about beings of exceptional size. The Mesopotamian tradition includes multiple references to powerful, legendary figures. The Sumerian king list describes kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. While clearly not literal chronology, this reflects a tradition of an ancient past when things were different, when the rules governing human life weren't what they became. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes its hero as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, born from a goddess mother and a mortal father. Gilgamesh is portrayed as extraordinarily large and strong. The epic describes him and his companion Enkidu as capable of feats no normal human could accomplish. In the Atrahasis epic, another Mesopotamian flood story, the gods create humans to be workers, to serve the gods' needs. When humanity becomes too numerous and too noisy, the gods send the flood to reduce the population. The parallels to Genesis are obvious but with different theological frameworks. In Genesis, the flood comes because of moral corruption. In Atrahasis, because of divine annoyance. Egyptian texts describe powerful foreign rulers and warriors using hyperbolic language. Enemies of Egypt are sometimes depicted as giants to emphasize Egyptian victory over them. This might be pure propaganda, or it might reflect genuine cultural memory of certain populations producing notably large individuals. Greek mythology is filled with giants, the Titans, the gigantes who fought the Olympian gods, individual heroes of exceptional size like Ajax and Heracles. The Titans were the generation before the Olympian, overthrown in a cosmic war. The gigantes were offspring of Gaia, the earth, who rebelled against the gods and were destroyed. These Greek traditions parallel the biblical narrative in structure. There was an older generation, beings of great power who threatened cosmic order. They were defeated in divine conflict. Order was restored. What's striking is the widespread nature of these traditions. From Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Israel to India, where the Mahabharata describes mighty warriors of old, to northern Europe, where Norse mythology includes the Jotnar, the giants in constant conflict with the gods. Cultures across the ancient world preserved stories about beings larger and more powerful than current humans who lived in an earlier age and were destroyed or driven away. Scholars have proposed various explanations for this universality. Carl Jung suggested giants represent archetypal psychological figures, the overwhelming power of nature, of parents in childhood, of challenges that seem insurmountable. Others suggest these stories preserve dim memories of encounters between Homo sapiens and other hominid species like Neanderthals or Denisovans. Ho were physically different and were eventually displaced. Another theory: agricultural societies looking at megalithic structures built by earlier cultures, massive stone monuments like Stonehenge, the pyramids, or the walls of Mycenae, wondered how such things were possible and concluded they must have been built by beings of greater strength than current humans. Or perhaps certain populations genuinely did produce larger individuals on average due to genetic factors, and these differences became legendary over time, exaggerated in retelling, until historical figures of 6'6" became mythological giants of 10 or 12 feet. The biblical tradition fits into this broader ancient Near Eastern context. Israel wasn't unique in having giant traditions. What's unique is how Israel theologized them, connecting them to creation boundaries, to divine judgment, to the flood, to the conquest of Canaan, and finally to David's victory. Let's return to the specific biblical claim that the Anakim and Rephaim descended from the Nephilim of Genesis 6. What did ancient interpreters make of this connection? The Book of Enoch, as we've discussed, describes the Watchers descending to Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real place, a snow-capped mountain on the border between modern Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. In biblical times, it marked the northern limit of Israelite territory. Deuteronomy 3:8-9 describes it, and Joshua 13:5 mentions it as a boundary marker. Why did the tradition place the Watchers' descent there? Perhaps because Mount Hermon was sacred space in various ancient Near Eastern religions. Psalm 133:3 mentions the Dew of Hermon. It was a liminal space, the northernmost reach of Israelite territory, a mountain that touched the sky, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers swearing an oath there, binding themselves to their plan. Chapter 6 states, "And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jard on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it." The text is providing an etymology. The name Hermon is connected to Hirm, meaning something devoted or under oath. Whether this etymology is historically accurate or creative interpretation, it shows how the tradition tried to ground supernatural events in real geography. The offspring of the Watchers and human women, according to Enoch, were the giants. Chapter 7 describes them as 300 cubits tall in some manuscripts, approximately 450 feet, clearly hyperbolic. Other versions give more modest but still impossible heights. The point isn't literal accuracy but emphasizing their unnatural nature. These giants, the text says, consumed all the resources. They ate everything humans could produce. When that wasn't enough, they turned to violence, against humans, against animals, against each other. Enoch 7:5 states, "And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood." This is total corruption, not just moral but ecological. The natural order breaks down. Boundaries between species blur. Violence becomes universal. The biblical flood comes as a response to this corruption. But Enoch adds an interesting detail. According to Enoch 10, the giants are killed before the flood, destroyed in internal conflicts and through divine angels who bind the watchers and destroy their offspring. The flood then cleanses the earth of the remaining corruption. Yet Numbers 13 reports Nephilim in Canaan centuries later. How does the tradition explain this? The Book of Jubilees, chapter 7, offers one explanation. After the flood, according to Jubilees, the demons, the spirits of the dead giants, continue to plague humanity. They're not physical giants anymore, but spiritual forces. This tradition influenced later Jewish and Christian demonology. But this doesn't fully answer how physical giants, the Anakim, the REPHAIM, appear in Canaan. For that, some later Jewish traditions propose that Ham, Noah's son, had knowledge of forbidden things learned from pre-flood sources. Others suggested Ham's wife or one of the other wives on the ark carried genetic corruption that manifested in later generations. These explanations are speculative, attempts by later interpreters to reconcile Genesis 6:4's phrase, "and also afterward," with the flood's supposed totality. The academic explanation is simpler. Genesis 6:1-4 is a fragment of older tradition that the biblical editors included without fully integrating it into the flood narrative. Numbers 13, written or compiled by different authors in different contexts, independently mentions Nephilim to describe frightening enemies. The connection between the two passages might not have been carefully coordinated. Later interpreters worked to harmonize what were originally separate traditions. But the theological narrative, the final biblical text creates, is coherent. There was corruption before the flood. It somehow persisted or re-emerged. It manifested in the Canaanite peoples Israel encountered, and David eliminated the last of it. Now let's consider the Philistines themselves. Who were they, and why does the biblical narrative specifically associate Gath with giants? The Philistines were part of the Sea Peoples, groups who migrated into the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Egyptian sources, particularly reliefs and inscriptions from the time of Ramesses III, describe battles against these invading people. The Egyptians repelled them from Egypt itself, but couldn't prevent them from settling in coastal Canaan. The Philistines established 5 major cities, the Pentapolis, along the southern coastal plain: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each city had its own ruler, but they cooperated militarily. Archaeological evidence reveals the Philistines brought different material culture from the Canaanites they displaced. Their pottery is distinct, often decorated with geometric patterns and birds, showing connections to Aegean cultures. Some scholars trace Philistine origins to the Aegean islands, possibly Crete or Cyprus, based on these cultural markers. The biblical text itself hints at this. Amos 9:7 states, "Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" Caphtor is often identified with Crete or the broader Aegean region. So the Philistines were, in a sense, immigrants, arriving in Canaan around the same time as Israel was emerging in the hill country. Both groups were newcomers establishing themselves in a land with existing populations and cultures. Now, why does Gath specifically get associated with giants in the biblical narrative? Gath was one of the 5 Philistine cities, located inland from the coast, the easternmost of the Pentapolis, closest to Israelite territory. Tel-e-Safi in modern Israel is identified by many scholars as the location of ancient Gath. Excavations there have revealed massive fortifications, evidence of wealth and power, and a destruction layer dated to around 830 BCE, when the city was apparently conquered by Hazael of Aram. Gath in the biblical narrative is where Goliath comes from. It's where David fled when escaping Saul, 1 Samuel 21 and 27. It's where all the giant warriors David's men fight are from. Why? One possibility is that Gath genuinely did produce or attract particularly large warriors. Perhaps it was a military center where elite fighters trained or lived. Perhaps certain families in Gath, maintaining older Aegean martial traditions, or simply through genetic factors, produced larger individuals on average. Another possibility is that Gath's reputation grew over time. After David killed Goliath from Gath, after David lived in Gath and knew its warriors, after repeated conflicts with Gath throughout the early monarchy, the city became legendary in Israelite memory. It was the city of powerful enemies, and that reputation crystallized into stories about giants. The biblical text in Joshua 11:22 says Anakim survived only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod after Joshua's campaign. This detail might be historical. Perhaps populations in Philistine cities genuinely were different, ethnically or physically, from the surrounding Canaanites. Or it might be etiological, explaining why Philistines remained militarily superior to Israel for generations. What we can say is that Gath occupies a unique position in biblical tradition. It's the city David knew best. It's where Israel's most famous enemies came from, and it's where the tradition located the last of the REPHAIM. When David fought in the valley of REPHAIM against Philistine armies, when his warriors later killed giants from Gath, the biblical narrative was describing the end of Gath's dominance. David's reign marked the shift. After him, Israel would dominate the Philistines, not the reverse. The valley of REPHAIM was where that shift happened. Let's examine David himself more closely. What did these battles mean for him personally in the biblical portrayal? David's biography in 1 and 2 Samuel is complex and psychologically rich. He's introduced as a shepherd boy, youngest son, almost overlooked when Samuel comes to anoint Israel's next king. He defeats Goliath as a youth, an act of faith and courage that makes him famous. He serves Saul, becomes best friends with Jonathan, marries Saul's daughter Michal, and leads successful military campaigns. Then Saul's jealousy turns murderous. David flees. He becomes an outlaw, gathering a band of followers. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. 1 Samuel 22:2. 400 men, later 600, living on the edges of Judean wilderness and Philistine territory. In desperation, David seeks refuge in Gath. 1 Samuel 21 describes his first attempt. The servants of Achish, king of Gath, recognize him and say, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." David, terrified, pretends to be insane, scratching on doors, drooling into his beard. Achish dismisses him. "Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this?" It's almost comedic, this scene. David, giant killer, warrior, reduced to fake madness to escape. But later, in 1 Samuel 27, David returns to Gath with his 600 men. This time Achish accepts him. David lives in Philistine territory for over a year, actually gets his own city, Ziklag, to govern. He claims to be raiding Israelite and allied territories, but the text reveals he's actually attacking enemies of Israel and lying to Achish about his targets. This period is morally complex. David is living among Israel's enemies, nominally serving them while secretly working against them. He's a double agent, maintaining credibility with Achish while actually protecting Israel. When the Philistines gather to fight Saul at Gilboa, David is ready to march with them, but the other Philistine commanders don't trust him. They say to Achish in 1 Samuel 29:4, "What about these Hebrews? Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting." So David is sent home. He arrives to find Ziklag burned by Amalekite raiders, his wives and everyone else's families taken captive. He pursues, defeats the raiders, recovers everyone and everything. Meanwhile, Saul dies at Gilboa. David mourns him genuinely. The lament in 2 Samuel 1 is beautiful poetry. How the mighty have fallen. David becomes king over Judah, and civil war with Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth lasts 7 years. Finally, Ishbosheth is assassinated, and all Israel comes to David, making him king over the unified nation. This is when he captures Jerusalem and makes it his capital. And immediately, 2 Samuel 5:17, the Philistines respond. Their former client, the man who lived in Gath who served Achish, is now king over a unified Israel. This is a threat they can't ignore. They march into the valley of Rephaim. Imagine David's perspective at this moment. He's fought for years to survive, to build support, to unite Israel. He's finally achieved it. The kingdom is his, Jerusalem is his capital. Everything he's worked toward is coming together. And here come the Philistines, the people he lived among, the warriors of Gath, the city where he sought refuge twice. He knows them. He knows their tactics, their weapons, their strengths. But more than that, according to the biblical narrative, David knows their giants. He killed Goliath as a youth, the most famous warrior from Gath. Now armies from Philistine territory, including Gath, are spreading out in a valley literally named for giants. The biblical text emphasizes David's reliance on divine guidance. Before each battle in the valley of Rephaim, he inquires of the Lord. He doesn't assume he knows what to do. He asks and waits for direction. The first time, "Shall I go and attack the Philistine? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The answer is yes. David attacks at Baal Perazim and wins decisively. The second time, when the Philistines return to the same valley, "Shall I go?" The answer is different. Don't go straight at them. Circle around behind. Attack from the balsam trees. Wait until you hear the sound of marching in the treetops. That's the sign God has gone ahead of you. What's the sound in the treetops? Wind through leaves, divine footsteps, angelic armies. The text doesn't explain, but the image is powerful. David waiting, listening, watching for a supernatural sign, then striking at the perfect moment. These victories secure David's kingdom. The Philistines don't threaten Jerusalem again in David's lifetime. The balance of power has shifted permanently, but the battles with individual giants continue. 2 Samuel 21 places these encounters later, after Absalom's rebellion, near the end of David's reign. They're almost afterthoughts in the narrative, additional notes about conflicts with Philistine warriors. Yet they matter, because they complete the pattern. David as a youth killed Goliath. David as king defeats Philistine armies. David as an aging king and his warriors on his behalf kill the last giants from Gath. The biblical narrative presents David as the culmination figure, the one who finishes what Moses and Joshua began. Under David, Israel finally eliminates the Rephaim lineage that had survived in Philistine territory. Whether David himself understood his role this way, we can't know. The text is written from later perspective, by authors who saw David's reign as Israel's golden age, who connected his victories to the larger theological narrative about removing corruption from the land. But within that narrative framework, David functions as the divinely chosen agent who completes the conquest, not just politically, unifying the tribes, establishing the monarchy, securing the borders, but theologically, ending the bloodline that shouldn't have existed. Let's consider the symbolic geography of the valley of Rephaim more carefully. Valleys in biblical literature carry meaning beyond mere topography. They're places of conflict, of decision, of divine judgment. The valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel 3 is where God will judge the nations. The valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, becomes synonymous with judgment and punishment. The valley of Achor in Joshua 7 is where Achan is executed for his sin. But Hosea 2:15 later describes it as a door of hope. Valleys are low places, vulnerable, exposed. Armies in valleys can be attacked from high ground. But valleys are also fertile, productive, necessary for agriculture. They're places of provision and danger combined. The valley of Rephaim, named for giants, fits this symbolic pattern. It's the place where Israel's enemies gather, where David faces threats to his new kingdom. But it's also where David wins decisive victory, where the last giants fall. After David, the valley doesn't feature prominently in biblical narrative. Isaiah 17:5 mentions it in passing, as when reapers harvest the standing grain in the valley of Rephaim. It's returned to its agricultural purpose, a normal valley where normal people grow crops. The giants are gone. The valley is just a valley. This transformation from place of threatening others to place of normal life reflects the biblical narrative's larger arc. The strange, the dangerous, the anomalous is defeated. Order is restored. Life can proceed normally. But the name remains. The Valley of Rephaim, a memorial to what was, to what ended there. Future generations would pass through that valley and remember, this is where giants once stood. This is where David defeated them. This is where that old story finally concluded. Now, let's examine how different theological traditions have grappled with the moral implications of these narratives. The conquest narratives, Joshua's campaigns, the command to destroy certain peoples, David's battles, raise profound ethical questions. How do we understand commands for complete destruction? How do we square divine love with texts describing genocide? Jewish interpretation has wrestled with these questions for millennia. Some medieval Jewish commentators argued the commands applied only to specific historical circumstances. The unique situation of Israel entering Canaan, surrounded by peoples whose religious practices included child sacrifice and cult prostitution. The point wasn't ethnic hatred but preventing spiritual corruption. Other Jewish interpreters emphasized that these commands may have been hyperbolic warfare rhetoric rather than literal instructions. Ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts regularly use totalizing language. We killed every living thing. That archaeological evidence reveals wasn't literally true. Cities described as completely destroyed often show continuous occupation. The language is about victory, dominance, and divine favor, not literal extermination. Modern Jewish ethicists often point to the Talmudic tradition that Joshua offered peaceful surrender to Canaanite cities before attacking them. According to this tradition, preserved in texts like Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, any city that accepted Israel's sovereignty and agreed to follow basic ethical laws, the Noahide laws, would be spared. The destruction was for those who chose violent resistance. Christian interpretation has similarly evolved. Early Christians read the conquest narratives typologically. Canaan represents the kingdom of God. The battles represent spiritual warfare against sin and evil. The physical conquest foreshadows the spiritual conquest that Christ accomplishes. This spiritual reading allowed Christians to maintain the Old Testament as scripture while not literally applying its warfare commands. Paul writes in Ephesians 6:12, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. However, this spiritual interpretation has been used to justify actual violence at various points in Christian history: crusades, conquest of indigenous peoples in the Americas, colonialism. The line between spiritual metaphor and literal application has been blurred with horrific results. Modern Christian ethicists emphasize reading these texts in their ancient Near Eastern context, while also critiquing them. Some argue the texts reflect human understanding of God in a specific time and place, that Israel's writers attributed their military victories to divine command, because that's how ancient peoples understood warfare. But that doesn't mean God actually commanded genocide. Others maintain the texts are accurate, but argue the situations they describe were unique, a one-time divine judgment against specific peoples whose corruption had reached an extreme point. These interpreters emphasize that the New Testament shows God's fuller revelation, centered on Christ's command to love enemies. Liberation theology, emerging from contexts of oppression, has sometimes read these texts differently, seeing the Exodus and conquest as God siding with oppressed people, Hebrew slaves, against oppressors, Egyptian empire, Canaanite city-states. The violence is regrettable but understandable as the oppressed fighting for liberation and land. Islamic tradition approaches the matter differently. The Quran presents prophets as moral exemplars. War in Islamic tradition is regulated by strict ethical guidelines: no killing non-combatants, no destroying crops or property unnecessarily, accepting surrender, treating prisoners well. If biblical accounts of conquest appear to violate these principles, many Muslims would say the biblical accounts are either corrupted or misunderstood. The question of the REPHAIM specifically adds another layer. If these were genuinely corrupted beings, not fully human, carrying genetic pollution from Genesis 6's boundary violation, does that change the moral calculus? The biblical narrative seems to present their elimination as restoring creation's proper order, not ethnic cleansing. But this raises dangerous questions. Throughout history, dehumanizing enemies, calling them less than human, claiming they're corrupted or evil, has justified atrocities. The REPHAIM tradition could be read as ancient Israel's way of dehumanizing their enemies to make conquest psychologically acceptable. There's no easy resolution to these ethical dilemmas. The texts describe what ancient peoples believed about God's commands and their holy wars. How we apply, or don't apply, these texts today requires wrestling with history, ethics, theology, and the recognition that Scripture was written in specific cultural contexts that differ vastly from our own. What we can say is this: the biblical authors presented the elimination of the REPHAIM as necessary and good, as completing a divine mission that began before the flood. Whether we accept that theological framework, how we understand it, and what ethical conclusions we draw, these are questions each reader, each faith community must answer. Let's shift now to literary analysis. How do the REPHAIM narratives function as story? What themes do they develop? The through line from Genesis 6 to 2 Samuel 21 creates narrative tension around the question: will the corruption be eliminated? The flood seems to resolve it, everything destroyed, reset accomplished. But and also afterward immediately reintroduces doubt. The problem persists. The spies in Numbers 13 confirm it. The Nephilim are still here. The next generation, their descendants, are in the land. The mission isn't complete. Joshua's campaign advances the goal. The Anakim are systematically destroyed in Israelite territory, but survivors remain in Philistine cities, still incomplete. David's victories in the valley of Rephaim and his warriors' battles with individual giants bring the story to conclusion. Finally, after all these centuries, after all these generations, the Rephaim are eliminated. The arc is complete. This narrative structure, problem introduced, apparently solved, revealed as unsolved, gradually resolved through multiple stages, creates dramatic tension across centuries of biblical history. It also creates theological meaning. Some corruptions are so deep they require generations to fully address. The REPHAIM function as the other, the alien presence that shouldn't exist in the land. Their elimination is necessary for Israel's true possession of the promised land. This is classic boundary establishment, defining the community by excluding what doesn't belong. But the REPHAIM are also liminal figures, neither fully divine nor fully human, if we follow the Nephilim interpretation. They exist in the border space between categories. Their very existence is boundary violation. Their elimination represents the restoration of proper boundaries, proper categories, proper order. David, in this literary structure, is the boundary enforcer par excellence. He's the king who finally establishes Israel's borders securely, who completes the conquest, who ends the anomalous presence. His reign represents order triumphing over chaos. The Valley of Rephaim, as the setting for David's decisive victories, becomes symbolically loaded. It's the boundary between Israel's hill country and Philistine plains. It's named for the beings whose elimination is necessary. And it's where that elimination effectively happens, not in individual combats later, but in the major battles that break Philistine power. From a literary perspective, the Rephaim story also functions as ancient Israel's origin narrative. Every nation needs stories about defeating enemies, overcoming Chal, and Jez establishing identity. The Rephaim provide that, a clearly other enemy connected to cosmic forces, whose defeat demonstrates both military prowess and divine favor. The fact that they're giants adds to the heroic quality. David and Joshua aren't just defeating human enemies but legendary figures. It's like Greek heroes battling monsters. Victory is more meaningful because the challenge is greater. One more angle deserves attention: the question of what actually survived from these traditions in later Jewish and Christian thought. The Nephilim and Watchers appear in other ancient Jewish texts beyond Enoch and Jubilees. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran starting in 1947, include multiple texts discussing these figures. The Book of Giants, fragments of which were found at Qumran, describes the Nephilim's dreams and Enoch's role interpreting them. The Genesis Apocryphon retells and expands the Genesis narrative, including the mysterious Genesis 6 passage. Various Aramaic texts discuss the Watchers and their offspring. This shows the tradition remained active in Second Temple Judaism, roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE. These weren't marginal ideas, but part of how many Jews understood their ancient history and scripture. The New Testament includes references that assume readers know these traditions. Jude 1:6 states, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." This clearly refers to the Watchers tradition, describing angels who left their proper place and are now bound awaiting judgment. Jude even quotes directly from the Book of Enoch in verses 14-15, showing early Christians viewed it as authoritative, though it didn't end up in most Christian canons. 2 Peter 2:4 similarly states, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment." 1 Peter 3:19-20 mentions Christ preaching to the imprisoned spirits, who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and others accepted the Watcher/Nephilim interpretation of Genesis 6. They saw it as explaining the origin of demons, the source of idolatry, teaching forbidden knowledge, and part of the spiritual history of warfare between good and evil. However, from Augustine onward, early 5th century CE, the dominant Christian interpretation shifted. Augustine found the idea of angelic human reproduction problematic theologically and promoted the Sethite interpretation, that sons of God meant righteous human descendants of Seth, not angels. This became standard in Catholic and later Protestant interpretation for centuries, though the older angelic view never entirely disappeared and has seen revival in some modern evangelical scholarship. Jewish tradition after the Talmudic period largely moved away from emphasizing the Nephilim and Watchers traditions, possibly because they were adopted so prominently by Christians and later by various heretical groups. Rabbinic Judaism focused on Torah, ethics, and communal identity rather than speculative angelology, but the tradition never entirely died. Medieval Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, included complex angelology. The Zohar and other mystical texts discuss the fall of angels and its consequences. Folk traditions about demons and spirits often connected back to the Book of Enoch's claim that the spirits of dead giants became demons plaguing humanity. In Islamic tradition, as mentioned earlier, the Quranic account differs. Angels don't rebel in the way Enoch describes, but Iblis, Satan, does refuse to bow to Adam and is cast out. And the jinn, created beings distinct from angels or humans, have free will and can be righteous or rebellious. Some Islamic commentators wondered if biblical accounts of the Watchers might confusedly refer to jinn, though this is speculative and not mainstream Islamic interpretation. The REPHAIM specifically, as a biblical term, didn't generate the same elaborate tradition as the Nephilim and Watchers. They function in Scripture as the concrete manifestation in Canaan of the older corruption, but they didn't inspire separate apocryphal texts or extensive theological development. Their significance is in the biblical narrative itself, the thread connecting Genesis to Samuel, explaining why conquest was necessary and celebrating its completion under David. Let's return one final time to the valley itself. Today, as mentioned, it's a neighborhood in Jerusalem. Emek Rephaim Street is lined with cafes, shops, restaurants. People go about daily life, unaware that according to ancient tradition, this is where giants made their last stand. Tel Safi, probably ancient Gath, is an archaeological site. Visitors can walk through Exke. Vatted areas, see the massive fortifications. Imagine the city that once stood there. It's peaceful, quiet, nothing like the battlefield the biblical texts describe. The distance between ancient narrative and modern reality is vast. We can't recover what David experienced, what his soldiers felt, what the Philistine armies thought as they spread out in that valley 3,000 years ago. What we have are the texts, stories preserved, edited, compiled, canonized. They tell us what ancient Israel believed about their history, their enemies, their God, their king. Within that narrative world, the Valley of Rephaim is a place of completion. The biblical authors saw David's victories there as the conclusion of a story that began before human cities existed, before bronze tools were forged, before any of the nations that populated Canaan in historical times had emerged. They connected David to Moses, Moses to Noah, Noah to creation. They made Israel's struggles with Philistines about more than territory or military dominance. They made it about cosmic order, divine justice, the correction of ancient corruption. Whether this theological framework reflects historical reality, whether there really were Nephilim, whether beings of mixed divine-human nature existed, whether genetic corruption survived the flood, whether the Anakim were genuinely descended from these creatures, remains debated and ultimately unprovable. What's undeniable is that the tradition shaped ancient Israel's identity. They understood themselves as the people who defeated the giants, who eliminated the Rephaim, who completed what God commanded. David was the king who finished the conquest, who made the land fully Israel's, who ended the anomalous presence. The Valley of Rephaim stands in that tradition as the place where it happened, the final battlefield, the location of completion. And the name persists. 3,000 years later, people still call it the Valley of Rephaim, even if they don't know why, even if the giants, if they existed, are long forgotten, even if the cosmic significance the biblical authors saw in those battles seems like ancient mythology to modern minds. The valley remembers, the name remembers, the texts remember. And we're left to decide what we make of it all. History, mythology, theology, cultural memory, or some combination of elements we don't have categories for, shaped by worldviews so different from ours that full understanding may be impossible. But the story endures, and that perhaps matters more than whether every detail is literally true. Stories shape civilizations. The story of David and the Valley of Rephaim shaped Israel, shaped Judea, shaped Christianity, influenced Islam's understanding of biblical tradition. It's a story about boundaries, what should and shouldn't exist, who belongs and who doesn't, where creation's proper lines are drawn. It's a story about judgment, divine response to corruption, the price of violation, the necessity of restoration. It's a story about completion, missions that span generations, goals that take centuries to accomplish, final victories that end long struggles. Whether we affirm its theological framework or not, whether we read it as history or mythology, it remains powerful, because the questions it raises are eternal. What are the boundaries? Who gets to enforce them? What does it mean to eliminate the other? When is violence justified? How do we understand divine justice? Each generation must answer these questions for themselves. The ancient texts provide one answer, the answer ancient Israel gave, but the questions remain. 3,000 years. That's how long it's been since David fought in the Valley of Rephaim, since the biblical tradition claims the last giants fell, since this chapter of ancient Near Eastern history supposedly concluded. 3,000 years and we're still telling the story, still asking what it means, still wrestling with the questions it raises about boundaries, about otherness, about divine justice and human violence. But now, in this final part, let's ask different questions. Not just what the texts say or what ancient peoples believed, but what these stories reveal about us, about human nature, about how societies create identity, about the role mythology and history play in shaping civilizations. Because whether the Rephaim were real or not, whether giants literally walked in Canaan or the term described something else entirely, the fact that these stories were preserved, treasured, and incorporated into Scripture tells us something profound about the communities that told them. Let's explore what that might be. Start with the most basic question. Why do humans tell stories about giants? Anthropologists and folklorists have documented giant traditions across virtually every culture. From the Titans of Greek mythology to the Jotnar of Norse tradition, from the Rakshasas of Hindu epics to the giants of Native American legends, from Africa and folklore to Pacific Islander myths, the pattern repeats. There were beings larger and more powerful than us. They existed in an earlier age. They were defeated, driven away, or destroyed. This universality suggests something fundamental about human psychology or experience. One theory, proposed by scholars of comparative mythology, is that giant stories reflect childhood experience. To a small child, adults are giants, incomprehensibly large, overwhelmingly powerful, controlling the environment. As we grow, we defeat this power imbalance by becoming adults ourselves. Giant stories might be cultural expressions of this universal developmental experience. Another theory focuses on landscape. Ancient peoples encountered massive structures, megalithic monuments, enormous ruins, geological formations like towering mountains or massive boulders. Without understanding the true builders, earlier human societies with different technologies or causes, geological processes, they hypothesized. Giants must have done this. Only beings of immense strength could move such stones, build such walls, shape such landscapes. A third perspective emphasizes the other. Giants in folklore often represent foreign peoples, enemies, those outside the community. Making them literally larger transforms a social boundary into a physical one. It's not just that they're different. They're a different kind of being entirely. This psychological move makes conflict with them seem natural, necessary, even divinely mandated. The biblical REPHAIM tradition incorporates elements of all these. They're remnants of an earlier age, temporal otherness. They're associated with impressive locations and ancient memories, landscape connection. And they're explicitly the enemy, the ones who don't belong in the promised land, social otherness. But the biblical tradition adds a unique theological dimension. The REPHAIM aren't just big humans or foreign people. According to the interpretive tradition connecting them to Genesis 6, they're corrupted beings, the product of boundary violation between divine and human realms. Their existence isn't just inconvenient, it's ontologically wrong. Creation's proper order requires their elimination. This theological framework does something psychologically powerful. It removes moral ambiguity from conflict. You're not fighting people who simply want the same land you want, who have their own valid claims and perspectives. You're fighting corruption itself. You're restoring creation's proper order. You're completing a divine mission. We should recognize how dangerous this thinking can be. Throughout history, dehumanizing enemies, making them less than human, portraying them as corrupted or evil, has justified atrocities. The REPHAIM narrative, if misapplied, could license ethnic cleansing by framing it as theological necessity. Yet understanding why ancient peoples thought this way, how they processed conflict, otherness, and identity, helps us see both the power and the peril of these narratives. Let's consider what the Valley of Rephaim story reveals about kingship and legitimacy in ancient Israel. David's biography in Samuel is remarkably honest about his flaws, his adultery with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah, his failures as a father, the rebellion of his son Absalom. The biblical authors don't whitewash their heroes. This is part of what makes these texts so psychologically rich and historically valuable. The complexity, the moral ambiguity, the very human struggles. But David's victories over enemies, particularly over the Philistines and the giants from Gath, receive unambiguous celebration. These military triumphs establish his legitimacy as king in ways his personal life cannot. Why? Because ancient Near Eastern kingship was fundamentally about military success and divine favor. A king proved his right to rule by defeating enemies and expanding or securing territory. The gods, or in Israel's case, the God, showed favor through victory. Defeat suggested divine disfavor. Consistent victory proved divine approval. David's victories in the Valley of Rephaim, described in 2 Samuel 5, come immediately after his coronation over all Israel. The timing matters. The Philistines challenge the new king's authority. David responds with 2 decisive victories. His kingdom is secure. His legitimacy is established not just by anointing or popular support, but by divine intervention in battle. The text emphasizes David inquiring of the Lord before each battle. He doesn't rely on his own military experience, which was considerable, or his commander's advice. He seeks divine guidance and receives specific tactical instructions. When he wins, it's clear the victory comes from God, not merely from superior strategy or force. This pattern, king seeks divine guidance, receives it, follows it, wins, legitimates both David's specific reign and the broader institution of Israelite monarchy. It shows how kingship should work. The king submits. TS to divine authority. God grants victory, the kingdom prospers. The giants add another layer. David as a youth killed Goliath, the champion of Gath. Now David as king defeats Philistine armies in the valley of Rephaim. Later his warriors kill 4 more giants from Gath. The progression shows David's comprehensive victory over this threat, from individual champion to armies to the last remnants of the bloodline. In ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, this is exactly how great kings should be portrayed. They don't just win one battle, they systematically eliminate threats. They don't just defeat enemies, they eradicate them so thoroughly that those enemies never threaten the kingdom again. Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian kings, Babylonian rulers all used similar rhetoric. Their inscriptions describe total victory, complete destruction of enemies, the establishment of eternal peace. We know from archaeology that these claims were often exaggerated. Cities described as completely destroyed continued existing. People's claim to be utterly wiped out show up in later records. The biblical narrative about David and the Rephaim fits this broader pattern of ancient royal propaganda, not in the negative sense of deliberate falsehood, but in the sense of presenting the king's accomplishments in their most favorable, most theologically meaningful light. But here's what's interesting. The biblical texts preserve this even while also preserving David's failures. They celebrate his victories over the Philistines and giants while not hiding his moral catastrophe. This creates a complex portrait, a legitimately great king who is also deeply flawed, whose victories come from divine favor rather than personal perfection. Now let's examine how the Rephaim narrative functioned in ancient Israel's understanding of the land itself. The concept of the promised land is central to biblical theology. God promises Abraham that his descendants will possess Canaan. Generations later, after Egyptian slavery and wilderness wandering, Israel enters the land to claim that promise. But the land isn't empty. It's inhabited by multiple peoples: Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, Perizzites, Hivites, and others the biblical texts name. How does Israel understand their relationship to these people? How do they justify taking the land? The biblical texts offer multiple answers. One is divine gift. God promised this land to Abraham's descendants, therefore it's rightfully theirs regardless of current inhabitants. Another is divine judgment. The Canaanites' wickedness has reached the point where God is removing them from the land, using Israel as the instrument of judgment. Genesis 15:16 states explicitly that Abraham's descendants won't return until the sin of the Amorites has reached its full measure. The Rephaim tradition adds a third layer. Some inhabitants aren't just foreign peoples or even wicked people. They're corrupted beings whose very existence violates creation's proper order. They shouldn't exist anywhere, let alone in the promised land. Their elimination isn't conquest, it's restoration. It's making the land what it should be, what it would be if the Genesis 6 boundary violation had never occurred. This framing makes the land itself a character in the story. Canaan isn't just territory to be controlled. It's space to be purified, restored to its proper state. The Rephaim's presence pollutes it. Their removal cleanses it. Leviticus 18:24-28 uses similar language about the land itself, vomiting out inhabitants whose practices violate divine law. The land has moral requirements. It can't tolerate certain corruptions. When inhabitants cross particular lines, the land expels them. This is, we should note, a theological claim native to one particular tradition. The Canaanites themselves obviously didn't see their presence as polluting their own land. The Philistines didn't think their cities were corrupted. These are Israelite theological interpretations of the conflict, ways of making sense of conquest and displacement within their understanding of divine purpose. But for ancient Israel, the land's identity was tied to these narratives. The Valley of Rephaim wasn't just a valley where battles happened. It was a place whose very name recalled the beings who once inhabited the land, whose elimination was necessary for Israel to truly possess their inheritance. After David, after the giants were gone, the land could be fully Israel, not just politically controlled but spiritually restored. The conquest was complete, not just the military conquest Joshua began, but the theological conquest, the purification of the land from ancient corruption. This way of thinking about land, as having moral requirements, as needing purification, as being polluted by certain inhabitants, has had enormous historical consequences. It's been used to justify colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide far beyond ancient Canaan. When people believe they have the divine mandate to purify land by removing or destroying current inhabitants, atrocities follow. Yet understanding how ancient peoples thought about land, boundaries, and belonging helps us recognize these patterns when they emerge in our own time. The REPHAIM narrative isn't just ancient history. It's a case study in how human communities create narratives that justify violence against the other. Let's turn now to the question of memory and tradition. How did these stories get preserved? Who kept them alive and why? The biblical texts we have are the product of complex transmission history. Scholars debate the dating and composition of various books, but few dispute that oral traditions preceded written texts, and that written texts went through multiple editorial stages before reaching the forms we have now. The stories about REPHAIM, about giants in Canaan, about David's battles in the valley, these were told and retold for generations before being written down. Why did they persist? What made them memorable? Partly, they're good stories. Giants make compelling villains. David's victories are dramatically satisfying. The connection to ancient pre-flood corruption adds mythological depth. These elements help stories survive in oral cultures. They're interesting enough to be worth repeating, meaningful enough to teach something about identity and values. But there's more than entertainment value. These stories did ideological work for ancient Israel. They explained who Israel was, why they belonged in the land, why their enemies didn't. They connected Israel's present to the deep past, all the way back to creation and the flood. They showed divine favor and divine plan working through history. When Israel faced ongoing conflicts with Philistines, which historically continued for centuries, the REPHAIM tradition helped make sense of it. These aren't just neighbors competing for resources. They're the descendants of beings who shouldn't exist, the last remnants of ancient corruption. Of course, conflict with them is existential. Of course, defeating them is necessary. The Valley of REPHAIM, as a specific location with a specific name, helped anchor these stories. Geography makes narrative concrete. Future generations could point to the valley and say, "There, that's where it happened. That's where David defeated them. That's why it's called the Valley of the Giants." Whether events actually occurred exactly as described matters less than the fact that the tradition connected those events to that place. The named location validates the story. The story explains the name. This mutual reinforcement helps traditions persist. We see similar patterns in cultures worldwide. Sacred geography, places associated with foundational events, helps communities maintain identity across generations. The location becomes a touchstone, a physical reminder of who we are and where we come from. For ancient Israel, the Valley of REPHAIM functioned this way. It was one of many locations throughout the land that carried memory. Bethel, where Jacob dreamed, Hebron, where Abraham lived, Gilgal, where Joshua set up stones, Shechem, where covenants were renewed. The landscape itself became a mnemonic device, a way of preserving cultural memory. And the stories attached to these places weren't just about the past. They spoke to the present and future. When later generations faced threats, they could remember, our ancestors defeated giants. God gave them victory over impossible odds. We can have confidence too. This is how tradition functions, not just preserving historical data but providing ongoing meaning, ongoing identity, ongoing hope. Let's consider the interpretive tradition, how later readers made sense of these texts. Jewish interpretation through the centuries has shown remarkable diversity. The Midrash, rabbinic commentaries on biblical texts, offer multiple readings of the same passages, often contradictory, all preserved together. The principle is that Torah has many faces, many levels of meaning. No single interpretation exhausts the text. Regarding the Nephilim and Rephaim, medieval Jewish commentators like Rashi offered naturalistic reading. The sons of God were judges or princes, powerful men, not angels. Their marriages to daughters of humans represented class mixing or intermarriage between righteous and wicked lines. The Nephilim were simply strong warriors, and their exceptional size was relative or exaggerated in retelling. Other Jewish sources maintained the supernatural reading. The Zohar and Kabbalistic texts discuss the fall of angels, the corruption of creation, the spiritual forces unleashed by the Genesis 6 event. These readings saw the physical narrative as reflecting deeper spiritual realities about the forces of impurity that entered creation. What's striking is that both readings, naturalistic and supernatural, were considered valid. Different Jews in different contexts could emphasize different meanings based on their needs and perspectives. Christian interpretation, as mentioned earlier, was initially dominated by the angelic reading. Early church fathers saw clear connections between the Watchers tradition and Christian demonology. The fallen angels who became demons were the same beings who had descended before the flood. This interpretation supported Christian teaching about spiritual warfare, about the reality of demonic forces, about the cosmic scope of Christ's victory. When Colossians 2:15 describes Christ having disarmed the powers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Some early Christians connected this to the binding of the Watchers described in Enoch. But after Augustine, the Sethite interpretation became standard in most Christian traditions for centuries. This avoided theological problems about angels having physical bodies and reproducing. It kept the narrative within human history rather than involving supernatural elements that seemed mythological. Modern critical scholarship approaches these texts differently, not asking which interpretation is theologically correct, but how did these texts function in their ancient context? The goal is historical understanding rather than doctrinal application. This approach reveals that the biblical texts themselves contain layers, older traditions incorporated into later frameworks, different sources woven together, editorial hands shaping the final form. Genesis 6:1-4 might be a fragment of older Canaanite or Mesopotamian mythology that Israelite scribes reinterpreted within their own theological framework. The Rephaim mentions in Deuteronomy and Joshua might reflect actual memories of peoples in Canaan, whether genuinely distinctive in size or simply militarily formidable. That became legendary over time. The connection to Genesis 6 might have been made later, as interpreters tried to make sense of why these giants existed and where they came from. David's battles in the valley of Rephaim, from a critical historical perspective, were probably real military conflicts with Philistine forces. The emphasis on giants and divine guidance reflects how later scribes framed these victories theologically, connecting them to the larger conquest narrative and demonstrating David's legitimacy. None of these scholarly observations necessarily disprove the traditional readings. They simply show that texts have history. They develop over time, accumulate meaning, get reinterpreted by successive generations for different purposes. What remains constant is that communities have found these texts meaningful. They've used them to understand God, history, identity, and purpose. The Rephaim tradition, whatever its historical basis, has functioned religiously for 3 millennia. Now let's examine what archaeology can and cannot tell us about these traditions. Archaeology is fundamentally about physical remains, pottery, buildings, bones, tools, weapons, inscriptions. It can tell us about material culture, about what people built and used, about population movements and economic systems. What it struggles with is narrative, connecting physical evidence to specific stories and traditions. Can archaeology confirm there were giants in Canaan? Define giants. If we mean people averaging 8 or 9 feet tall, no. The skeletal remains don't support this. Human remains from Bronze and Iron Age Canaan show typical human size variation, with some populations slightly taller on average than others, but nothing extraordinary. If we mean populations that produced some individuals of exceptional height, say 6'6" or taller, then maybe. This is statistically normal in any population, and if certain families or lineages had genetic factors favoring height, they could have produced multiple such individuals. But archaeology can't identify specific families or prove they were systematically taller. Can archaeology confirm the Philistines had warriors of exceptional size from Gath? Tel Safi excavations show Gath was a major city with impressive fortifications. It was clearly powerful, but connecting this archaeological site to specific biblical narratives about individual warriors is impossible. We don't have labeled graves saying, "Here lies Goliath, 9 feet tall." What archaeology can do is provide context. It shows us what warfare looked like in this period, the weapons, the armor, the tactics. Bronze Age and early Iron Age combat was brutal, close quarters, dependent on physical strength and individual prowess. Warriors who were larger and stronger would have significant advantages. Archaeology also shows the Philistines were different from surrounding populations. Their material culture, pottery, architecture, dietary remains, marks them as distinct. They were newcomers to the region, arriving around 1200 BCE. The biblical narrative's presentation of them as foreigners, as different, matches what archaeology reveals. The Valley of REPHAIM itself has been partially excavated. Archaeological surveys and excavations in this area have found remains from various periods: Bronze Age, Iron Age, later periods. There's nothing specifically connecting these remains to the battles 2 Samuel describes, but that's not surprising. Ancient battles didn't necessarily leave distinctive archaeological signature unless there was significant burning or systematic destruction. What's perhaps most relevant archaeologically is what we find about the emergence of Israel itself. Contrary to Joshua's narrative of rapid military conquest, archaeology suggests a more gradual process. Hilltop villages emerging in the Central Highlands around 1200 BCE, growing over time, developing distinct Israelite material culture, different pottery styles, different architecture, absence of pig bones suggesting dietary laws. This doesn't mean the conquest narratives are entirely fictional. It means they're more complex than straightforward historical reporting. They might telescope centuries of gradual settlement and conflict into a shorter, more dramatic narrative. They might emphasize certain victories while passing over more ambiguous interactions. They might frame in theological terms what was actually a messy, complicated, multi-generational process. The same likely applies to the REPHAIM. There might have been real peoples in Canaan and Transjordan known for military prowess, possibly for producing larger warriors. These groups might have been gradually displaced, defeated, or absorbed over time. The biblical narrative frames this as systematic elimination of corrupted beings, connecting it to Genesis 6 and presenting David as completing the mission. Archaeology confirms conflict, population changes, the emergence of Israel as a distinct group, the presence of Philistines as powerful adversaries. It can't confirm or deny the specific theological framework the biblical authors used to interpret these events. Let's address directly, what if the giants weren't real? What if the Nephilim never existed? What if Genesis 6 is mythology, not history? Does that make these texts meaningless? This is where different faith communities diverge significantly. For those who read Scripture as literal history, inerrantist or fundamentalist approaches, the physical reality of the Nephilim and REPHAIM is important. If they didn't exist, the biblical account is false, and Scripture's reliability is compromised. This perspective sees defending the historical reality of giants as defending biblical authority. For those who read Scripture as complex literature containing multiple genres, history, poetry, prophecy, mythology, wisdom, the question is more nuanced. Genesis 6, 1-4 might be mythological in genre, expressing theological truth through story rather than making historical claims. The REPHAIM traditions might blend historical memory of conflicts with legendary embellishment, using the language of giants to convey the magnitude of the threat and the significance of victory. From this perspective, the texts remain meaningful even if not literally historical. They reveal how ancient Israel understood itself, its enemies, its God, its mission. They provide theological insight about creation, corruption, boundaries, and restoration. They function as scripture not because they're scientifically accurate, but because they truthfully reveal God's character and humanity's condition, just in different ways than a modern history textbook does. Secular scholars generally aren't concerned with defending scriptural authority, but with understanding ancient texts in their contexts. From this view, the REPHAIM traditions are valuable evidence of how ancient Near Eastern peoples thought, their worldviews, their ways of processing otherness and conflict, their methods of legitimating conquest and kingship. Whether giants existed matters less than understanding why ancient peoples told stories about giants. The psychological, sociological, and cultural functions of these narratives remain real and significant regardless of their historical basis. What we can say with confidence is this: ancient Israel believed in the REPHAIM. They told stories about them. They preserved those stories in their most sacred texts. They connected those stories to their understanding of their land, their enemies, their history, and their God. This belief shaped actions, policies, identity, and culture. In that sense, the REPHAIM were real, not necessarily as physical beings, but as cultural forces. They existed in the imaginative world ancient Israel inhabited, and that imaginative world shaped the real world of political decisions, military conflicts, and social boundaries. Now let's consider what these traditions reveal about the human need to understand evil. Every culture wrestles with the question, where does evil come from? Why do people hurt each other? Why is there violence, cruelty, suffering? The Genesis 6 tradition, a special lie as elaborated in texts like Enoch, provides one answer. Evil entered the world through boundary violation. Divine beings crossed a line they shouldn't have crossed. They taught humanity knowledge humanity wasn't ready for. Their offspring spread violence. The corruption became so total that the world had to be destroyed and remade. This explanation is psychologically powerful. It externalizes evil's origin. It came from outside humanity initially, from rebellious angels, from forbidden knowledge. This provides a kind of comfort. We're not inherently evil, we were corrupted. But it also acknowledges evil's depth. The corruption infected human nature at a fundamental level. It wasn't just bad behavior that could be corrected by better laws or education. It was genetic, spiritual, cosmic. It required flood-level intervention to address. And even then it persisted. The phrase "and also afterward" in Genesis 6:4 is devastating in its implications. The corruption survived. The reset wasn't complete. Evil proved more resilient than even divine judgment. The REPHAIM tradition carries this forward. The corruption manifested in Canaan. It had to be systematically eliminated through Joshua's campaigns, through David's battles, through generation after generation of conflict. Evil isn't defeated once for all. It requires ongoing resistance. This is, we should note, a darker view than some religious traditions offer. Some forms of optimistic theology suggest evil is superficial, easily overcome through enlightenment or proper education or social reform. The REPHAIM tradition suggests something more pessimistic. Evil is deep, resilient, requiring violent elimination in some cases. But there's also hope in the tradition. Evil can be defeated. It was defeated according to the biblical narrative. David's victories represent evil's final elimination from the promised land. Order is restored. Creation returns to its proper state. Christian theology reads this typologically. David's defeat of the giants foreshadows Christ's victory over sin and death. The partial, temporary victory David achieved points forward to Christ's complete, eternal victory. What David did in one valley, Christ does cosmically. Jewish tradition emphasizes ongoing struggle. The defeat of the REPHAIM is one chapter, but evil takes new forms. Each generation faces its own giants, its own corruptions, its own battles. The tradition provides confidence that victory is possible. Look at what David did, while acknowledging the fight continues. Islamic theology, with its different framework, still wrestles with evil's origin and persistence. Iblis's rebellion, the jinn's capacity for wickedness, humanity's own tendency toward forgetfulness and sin. These provide different answers to the same fundamental questions the REPHAIM tradition addresses. What's universal is the human need to understand why evil exists and how to combat it. The REPHAIM tradition is one culture's answer, one theological framework for making sense of violence, corruption, and the necessity of judgment. Let's examine the Valley of REPHAIM specifically as a liminal space, a threshold, a boundary place. In anthropology and religious studies, liminal spaces are places of transition, ambiguity, transformation. They're neither here nor there but between. Doorways, crossroads, boundaries. These are classic liminal spaces in human culture. Valleys can function this way. They're low places between high places, paths between territories, spaces that belong to neither mountain nor plain but exist as transitions between them. The Valley of REPHAIM sat between Judean hill country and Philistine coastal plain. It was literally a boundary, between Judah and Benjamin tribally, between Israelite and Philistine territory politically. Battles fought there were about controlling this threshold, this in-between space. But the valley was liminal in another sense. It was named for beings who themselves were liminal. The REPHAIM, if we follow the tradition connecting them to Genesis 6, were neither fully human nor fully divine. They existed in the boundary space between categories. Their very existence was liminal, transgressive, boundary-violating. The valley named for them became the place where this liminality was resolved. David's victories there eliminated the ambiguity. The boundary beings were destroyed. The liminal space became Israelite space. Order replaced chaos. This pattern, conflict at liminal spaces, resolution through victory, transformation of ambiguous space into ordered space, appears throughout biblical narrative. The Jordan River, boundary between wilderness and promised land, is where Israel crosses to begin conquest. The Red Sea, between Egypt and wilderness, is where Pharaoh's army is destroyed and Israel's liberation becomes final. Liminal spaces are dangerous but also necessary. They're where transformation happens, where old identities end and new ones begin. The Valley of REPHAIM was where Israel's identity as a kingdom, united under David, secure in its capital, victorious over its greatest enemies, was forged. David crossed that valley from being a challenged new king to being an established monarch. Israel crossed from being threatened by Philistines to being the regional power. The last giants crossed from existence to extinction. Thresholds are where things change. The Valley of Rephaim was a threshold, geographically, politically, theologically. What changed there, according to biblical tradition, was the final removal of ancient corruption from the Promised Land. Now let's talk about giants in human imagination more broadly, why they fascinate us. Look at contemporary culture. Movies about giants, from fairy tale adaptations to fantasy epics to horror films. Books featuring giants, fantasy novels, children's stories, mythological retellings. Video games with giant enemies as major challenges. The fascination continues. What is it about beings larger than us that captures imagination? Psychologically, giants might represent challenges that feel overwhelming. Problems so big we can't see how to solve them. Enemies so powerful we fear we can't win. Obstacles so large they seem insurmountable. Stories about defeating giants are therefore stories about overcoming impossible odds. David and Goliath. The story's universal appeal lies in this dynamic. The small defeating the large, the weak overcoming the strong, the underdog winning. It's a narrative of hope for anyone who feels overmatched by life's challenges. The Valley of Rephaim battles operate on a larger scale. It's not one boy against one giant, but a king and army defeating multiple giants, systematically eliminating an entire bloodline. This is satisfaction at societal level, not just individual victory but collective triumph, not just one battle won but a war concluded. Giants also represent the past. Many cultures have legends of giant ancestors or earlier inhabitants. These stories often suggest a fall from a greater past. We're smaller, weaker, less impressive than we once were. Or conversely, they suggest progress. We defeated the giants, drove them out, proved ourselves superior despite physical disadvantage. The biblical Rephaim tradition contains elements of both. The giants represent an ancient corruption, beings who shouldn't have existed but did. Their defeat represents restoration, not to a greater past but to creation's proper order. Yet there's also acknowledgement that these were mighty warriors, men of renown, beings of power and fame. Defeating them was difficult, took generations, required divine intervention. There's also primal fear. Something much larger than us triggers instinctive terror. Predators, larger animals, towering natural phenomena, these make us feel small, vulnerable, prey rather than predator. Giants in stories embody this fear, and their defeat provides cathartic relief. The Valley of Rephaim in this reading is where Israel's primal fear of the Philistines, of superior warriors, of the giant lineage that ancient spies reported with terror, is finally overcome. David defeats what generations feared. The terror ends. Contemporary fascination with giants suggests these psychological dynamics remain active. We still feel small sometimes. We still face overwhelming challenges. We still need stories about the large being defeated by the clever, the courageous, the divinely favored. The biblical traditions about Rephaim serve these needs for ancient audiences and, through Scripture's ongoing influence, for modern audiences too. Let's address one more difficult question: the ethics of elimination. The biblical narrative presents the destruction of the Rephaim as good, necessary, divinely commanded. But stripped of theological framework, we're talking about the systematic killing of a people group. Even if that group produced unusually large warriors, even if they were militarily threatening, even if they practiced religions Israel found abhorrent. How do we think about this ethically? One approach is to accept the biblical framework. If these truly were corrupted beings whose existence violated creation's order, whose elimination was divinely commanded, then it was justified. From this perspective, Our ethical discomfort comes from not understanding the full situation. God, with perfect knowledge, knew what was necessary. Another approach is to recognize these texts come from a particular time and culture with different ethical norms. Ancient Near Eastern warfare was brutal by modern standards. Total destruction of enemy cities, killing of inhabitants, was standard practice, or at least standard rhetoric, across the region. The biblical texts reflect this cultural context. We can acknowledge the texts as historically valuable, as revealing how ancient peoples thought, without adopting their ethical frameworks wholesale. We can say, this is what they believed was right, but our understanding of human rights, of warfare, our ethics, of how to treat enemies has evolved. A third approach is to question the historicity of the elimination narratives. If archaeological evidence suggests more gradual, complex interactions between Israelites and other Canaanite people, including intermarriage, trade, cultural exchange, alongside conflict, then maybe the biblical texts present an idealized or simplified narrative that doesn't reflect the messy reality. The command to destroy might have been theological principle rather than literal instruction followed. The claim of complete elimination might be rhetorical hyperbole. The reality might have been far more ambiguous. This doesn't resolve the ethical problem entirely. Even rhetorical advocacy for genocide is troubling. Even theological frameworks that present elimination as divine will are dangerous. The texts remain problematic by modern ethical standards, but it helps us understand them in context without requiring us to defend every element. We can say, ancient Israel, in their context, with their understanding of God and purity and boundaries, believed this was necessary. We, with different context and understanding, reach different conclusions about how to treat enemies and how to interpret divine will. The challenge for communities that still treat these texts as scripture is navigating that tension. How do we honor these texts as sacred, while also critiquing elements that conflict with ethical principles we now hold? Different communities answer differently. Some emphasize the text's cultural context and don't try to apply them directly. Some look for deeper principles, perhaps about taking sin seriously or recognizing evil's reality, that can be affirmed while rejecting specific applications. Some struggle openly with the tension, acknowledging they don't have easy answers. What seems clear is that using these texts to justify contemporary violence, claiming divine mandate to eliminate people groups we label as corrupted, is dangerous misapplication. Even if we accept that God commanded specific actions in specific ancient contexts, that doesn't mean similar commands apply now. The Valley of Rephaim was 3,000 years ago, in a very different world, under very different circumstances. Whatever we learn from those traditions, it shouldn't be that eliminating others we deem corrupted is divinely sanctioned. Let's return to the valley itself one final time, but now thinking about memory and place. Jerusalem today is a complex city, layers upon layers of history, contested by multiple peoples, sacred to three major religions. The Valley of Rephaim, now the Rephaim neighborhood, is just one small part of this layered landscape. Walk down Rephaim Street today. You'll see cafes with people drinking coffee, shops selling clothes and books, children playing in parks. Life goes on, utterly normal, 3 millennia removed from the battles the biblical texts describe. The name remains. That's what's striking. The name persists even though few people probably know its origin, even though the story behind it has faded from common knowledge. This is how memory works. Names stick longer than narratives. Geography persists longer than history. Future generations inherit labeled landscapes without always knowing why the labels exist. But sometimes something triggers the question, why is it called that? What's the story? And then the ancient tradition resurfaces, and people encounter the biblical narrative about David and giants and divine victories, and they make of it what they will in their own context. Some will read it religiously, as scripture, as revelation, as truth about God's purposes in history. Some will read it historically, as evidence of ancient conflicts, as cultural artifacts, as windows into how Bronze and Iron Age peoples understood their world. Some will read it mythologically, as powerful stories that shaped civilizations even if not literally true. All these readings have value. The texts are rich enough to support multiple approaches. The valley is real enough, still there, still named, to ground the stories in geography while allowing interpretation to vary. What's remarkable is 3,000 years of transmission. Think about it. From the time these events allegedly occurred, or the time the stories about them emerged, to today is roughly 150 generations. The story has been told and retold, written and copied, translated and interpreted, studied and debated for all those generations. Some texts from antiquity survived by accident, buried in dry climates, preserved in ash from volcanic eruptions, forgotten in caves and discovered by chance. The biblical texts survived intentionally. Communities valued them enough to copy them carefully, to translate them when languages changed, to study them continuously, to shape their lives around them. The REPHAIM tradition survived because it mattered. It answered questions communities kept asking. It provided identity, meaning, explanation. It connected people to their past and gave framework for their present. And the valley, the actual geographical location, anchored this tradition. You can visit it. You can stand there. You can say, this is the place. Whether the battles happened exactly as described or not, this is the place the tradition remembers. This is where the story is set. That connection between narrative and landscape is powerful. It's why pilgrimages exist. People traveling to sacred sites, not because anything magical will happen there, but because physical presence in the storied place creates meaning. Standing where ancestors stood, where events occurred, where traditions locate their foundational moments. This grounds story in reality in ways words alone cannot. The Valley of Rephaim offers that grounding. The story of David and the giants, of conquest completed, of ancient corruption eliminated. This story is set here, in a place you can visit, in a valley that still bears the name it carried 3,000 years ago. That persistence of place and name, even as the meaning fades and returns with each generation, testifies to the story's power and to human need for connection with the past. In conclusion, what do we take from all this? What do these ancient texts about giants and valleys and kings and conquest offer us today? First, they offer a window into how ancient peoples thought, their cosmologies, their theodicies, their ways of processing otherness and conflict. We see how one small nation in the ancient Near East understood itself and its place in the world. We see how they connected their present to the deep past, how they understood divine purpose working through history. Second, they offer insight into the power of narrative. Stories shape civilizations. The Rephaim tradition, whatever its historical basis, shaped ancient Israel's identity, influenced Jewish and Christian theology, affected how believers understood warfare, judgment, and divine will. Stories have consequences. The narratives we tell about ourselves and our enemies matter enormously. Third, they offer psychological insight. The universal fascination with giants, the need to understand evil's origins, the desire for final victory over overwhelming threats. These are human universals. The biblical traditions address these needs in specific ways that reveal both the particularity of ancient Israelite culture and the commonality of human experience. Fourth, they offer ethical challenges. How do we read texts that present violence as divinely mandated? How do we honor religious traditions while also critiquing elements that conflict with modern ethics? How do we prevent ancient narratives about eliminating corrupted enemies from being misapplied in contemporary contexts? These aren't easy questions, but wrestling with them is necessary. Fifth, they offer theological reflection. Whether we believe the REPHAIM existed or not, whether we read these texts as history or mythology or something between, they raise profound questions about creation, corruption, judgment, and restoration. They present one tradition's answers to questions every religious tradition must address. What went wrong in the world? How is it being fixed? What's our role in the process? And finally, they offer connection across time. When we read these texts, when we visit these places, when we tell these stories, we connect with countless generations before us who did the same. We join a conversation that's lasted 3 millennia. We participate in the ongoing human project of making meaning from our past, understanding our present, and hoping for our future. The Valley of REPHAIM, whether we visit the modern Jerusalem neighborhood or simply read about it in ancient texts, invites us into this conversation. It asks, what do you make of this? How do you understand these stories about giants and kings, about divine judgment and human violence, about boundaries crossed and order restored? Your answer will differ from others. It will be shaped by your culture, your faith tradition, if you have one, your experiences, your values. That's as it should be. These texts are old enough, rich enough, complex enough to support multiple readings. They've survived precisely because different communities in different contexts have found them meaningful in different ways. What seems important is engaging seriously, not dismissing them as primitive mythology if that's not your tradition, not defending them uncritically if it is, but wrestling with what they reveal about human nature, about how societies create identity, about the eternal questions of good and evil, belonging and otherness, judgment and mercy. These ancient texts, the Bible, the apocryphal writings, the traditions preserved across millennia, offer a window into how our ancestors understood their world. Whether we read them as history, allegory, theology, or cultural memory, they remain powerful narratives that shaped and continue to shape billions of lives. The questions they raise about human nature, divine justice, the boundaries of creation, the price of forbidden knowledge, are questions every generation must answer for itself. What actually happened in those ancient days? Perhaps that matters less than what these stories reveal about us, our fears, our longings, our eternal search for meaning in a mysterious world. The Valley of REPHAIM stands as testament to that search. A valley in Jerusalem, still bearing an ancient name, still holding ancient memories, still inviting each generation to encounter the stories and decide what they mean. The giants, whether they existed as the texts describe or not, have fallen. The valley remains. The stories endure. And we're left with the invitation to engage, to question, to learn, and to carry forward whatever wisdom we can glean from these ancient traditions as we face our own giants, fight our own battles, and write our own chapters in humanity's ongoing story.